Welcome to the American Medical Extended Reality Member Question and Answer Series. In this series, we'll be highlighting the incredibly diverse and talented AMXRA community, one interview at a time. Join me, Dr. Mark Zhang, founder and president of AMXRA, as we learn more about medical extended reality through the perspective of AMXRA members. Welcome to the American Medical Extended Reality Member Question and Answer. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Zhang. I'm the president and founder of AMXRA, and the Member Q&A is our chance to highlight some of the amazing members of the American Medical Extended Reality Association, hear what they do, and really break down some of the barriers and silos within MXR. So today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Howard Gurr. Howard, how are you doing today?
Mark, how you doing? Good.
Good. So, we always start these Q&As with kind of a simple question.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you? Who are you, Dr. Gurr?
I actually see myself as just a run-of-the-mill clinical psychologist, but somewhat of a geek. And I think that I've always had this bent towards finding ways to kind of improve clinical practice using technology. And so, for example, I actually computerized my practice in 1990.
Wow.
And most people who were with me, peers looked at me like I was odd. Like, why would you even bother doing that? And I would say things like, well, how long does it take you to do your billing? And they'd say, well, I dedicate a Saturday morning to billing. And I would say, well, it takes me 5 minutes to do my billing. The hardest part of my billing is folding the bills to put them in the envelopes. And so I did that in 1990. And then in 1998, I had like dial-up internet service. And it was $19 for the dial-up service. But for $24 a month, you could have a website. And so I looked at Microsoft, I think it was Microsoft Publisher, and it had a module to create a website. So in 1998, I used Microsoft Publisher and I created my own website. So people called me up and said, tell me about yourself. And I would say, look, you go on the internet, look. And so that became like, I was the only psychologist, I think, in the area that had a website in 98. And then in 2006, I started doing podcasts. And I had probably 100 or so podcasts up there, all on psychological related issues. And I started out doing, I guess what cutesy kind of, podcast. Like it'd be 5 minutes on why you really can't tell the difference between Pepsi and Coca-Cola, or why smoking actually reduces your IQ. And I would do all these little things. And then after a while, I realized people didn't want to hear me anymore. So I started using guests. And I started doing that a lot. And then I did the local Psychological Association podcast and New York State Psychological podcast. And then I kind of like lost my steam. It's hard to do podcasts on a regular basis, as you know. It's a lot of work. So I was always like one step ahead, I think, of technology and private practice. And that's where VR came in for me. So in 2000 or so, I came across Skip Rizzo's work. And he had a virtual classroom using it for diagnostic and treatment of ADHD kids. And I thought that was phenomenal, because at the time, all we had is like rating forms. And then we had like some, computerized tests were really technically correlational data, but also tedious and boring. And I thought, oh, this would be great. I could watch a kid in this virtual environment, and I could train them to focus in the virtual environment. But by the time I got to him, he already sold it off, and so he wasn't working with that anymore. And he was.
Howard, when was this? This was what year?
2000.
2000. So this is well before DK1 and this was when like VR was like not very affordable or accessible. That's
Exactly.
wow. Okay.
Right.
All right.
And at the time, there was only one major player in the field.
Hmm.
At that time, there was really Virtually Better from Georgia. That was the only company in the behavioral health realm. And so I really couldn't afford it. And the equipment was just too cumbersome. And I had to wait. And then around 2015, I came across this company called Sios from Barcelona, which is now Amelia XR Health. But at that time, it was Sios, and they were using Samsung phones as the engine and a Samsung Gear VR headset. And you can control the VR in the Samsung phone from my office in terms of working with patients. And that was it. That was the turning point for me. So in 2016, I started using VR in my private practice. But again, I ran into questions about, what's VR? Why are you using it? What is this thing? And there obviously wasn't any major acceptance, mass acceptance of VR at the time, or XR, anything. So I had to explain it to people. And with extended reality or virtual reality, telling someone about it doesn't have the same impact as someone experiencing it.
Headsets.
Right. So when someone wears a headset and they're in it, all of a sudden they get it. And so for me, I entered the realm of VR for my patients with phobias and anxieties. And the reason is that because prior to that, for the most part, if I had, let's say someone had a fear of flying, well, they'd sit in the office and I would say, okay, let's imagine that you're on a plane and let's work through your anxiety while you're using your imaginative skills. And ultimately, they have to take a flight. And in the old days, people would actually, have to escort them on a flight. But you can't do that easily anymore. And it's expensive and it's time consuming. So with virtual reality, I can put them on a virtual plane. I don't rely on their imagination anymore. They don't really have to work at it because it's all fed to them. And the data is very clear that virtual reality exposure is very close to real life exposure in terms of what the brain and the body does in terms of reactions. So it was a godsend because I could now solve people's problems very quickly using VR that I could not do before.
That's fascinating. I'm a palliative care physician. We have an analog. We have a saying about how in some of our interventions, really our choice of words, have doses, and you have to titrate kind of the dose to the situation. Do you see the same when it comes to exposure therapy, or is that still an area of exploration? I'm not as familiar. I imagine that's one of the benefits of VR is that you or any kind of immersive kind of experiences, you can kind of titrate and dose the effect for the situation and kind of gradually get people in, as opposed to, to your point earlier, back in, before this, either imagining or buying a ticket multiple times and then kind of going forward each time. That's quite expensive and not really accessible.
You're right. So yeah, the idea of using, it's kind of like a variation on systematic desensitization. So by using VR as an exposure tool, you could decondition them step by step. So for example, in the platform that I use, the VR for flying, for example, starts out with somebody in the house, in an apartment, waiting for the cab to come pick them up. And on the TV is running, and you could alter the TV's message to talk about the plane crash at the airport. So you've now yanked up their anxiety a bit. And then you have them in the car, and then you have them in the terminal, and then you have them walk onto the plane, but not get on the plane. And then you're having them on the plane, and then you could modify the environment. So I could modify where they're seated on the plane. I could modify the turbulence, the weather outside. I could modify whether the people behind them are moaning and groaning and making fearful, anxiety-provoking statements or not. So you yank up the anxiety level as much as they could tolerate, when they can tolerate it, and decondition the amygdala really from over responding inappropriately. But we could never do that before. I could take someone up in a plane 5 times in a session. So
Yeah.
I could not do that in real life. So that is just it just makes clinical sense. Of course, I don't understand why every clinician isn't using it, but it works effectively, and people get where they need to be very quickly. So about 1/3 of my referrals come from other clinicians who are working with patients, and in the process of the therapy, the patient would say, oh, by the way, I have to fly to somewhere, and I haven't been on a plane in 20 years, and I have 6 weeks before I go. So the therapists around here who know me would say, well, I can't get you there in 6 weeks, but Dr. Gurr can. And so they send them to me. I work with them primarily on the phobia response. I don't really step into their toes on anything else because I'm not interested in doing that, and I don't want to, interfere. So I specifically work with the phobias, get them to the point where they can fly, and they're gone. They go back to the therapist.
Wow. So you really, like, in less than 2 decades, you've really seen like kind of a massive change, I imagine. Like, you were there for just that, like, transition to kind of a much more accessible kind of device.
Yeah.
Literally from your words, back in 2000, there was like basically one player probably using like a 20-pound, like a big boy kind of headset, industrial grade, and then 10 years later or so, you're using smartphone like the Gear solution, and I bet you, what are you using now for your VR work?
So since the pandemic, we haven't been seeing people face to face. So I'm using other people's cell phones as the engine, and what they do is they buy a rather inexpensive HMD, off Amazon for like $16-17.
Yeah.
And so they're using their cell phone wherever they are, and I'm using my computer. I control their cell phone from my office.
I see.
So I control their virtual environment, and they also can do it on their own. There's these homework modules that they can do on their home. Mostly it's relaxation and mindfulness and Jacobson muscle relaxation, things that they could practice on their own.
Yeah.
But it's really just using a cell phone at this point, and as I said, a cheap head-mounted display. It's pretty amazing that's where we're at.
That's pretty great, and you've really become kind of a specialist in kind of using VR for exposure therapy. Do you see this as kind of a growing field amongst kind of psychologists and mental health professionals? Is there I know of a handful.
It should be.
It should be. It seems like it could be a pretty incredible tool in the toolkit. What do you see as kind of the rate limiters or the challenges for wider adoption?
There's several, unfortunately. First of all, I think that extended reality and virtual reality hasn't hit the mass appeal that it needs to in general. And I think that it's still perceived as gaming and something to fool around with as opposed to a clinical or therapeutic tool. So it really hasn't hit that mark, so to speak, where it really crosses into acceptance. The other thing is that clinicians, for the most part, are very conservative, and they don't want to step into territory that they're not trained in. And so we don't have a lot of programs where virtual or extended reality are actually offered as classes or training. I know on Long Island, Hofstra University has a VR set, and they train their graduate students in the use of VR for phobias and PTSD. But they're the only ones I know. So there's the conservative, there's the fear that they don't know the technology, they're not comfortable with technology. And then the other concern is that, well, there's two other concerns. One other concern is that is that some people believe that extended reality and virtual reality gets in the way of the therapeutic relationship. Like it becomes a barrier in between the clinician and the therapist, because the patient's in another kind of virtual kind of environment. They're not with the therapist, so to speak, which I find not true, but that's the concern is. And the other piece, which is very interesting, is that clinicians, like, for example, as I understand it, the American Psychological Association has a ruling that to have an accreditation in an APA accredited program, there can't be classes on business or private practice. But,
to keep it pure, if you will.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So what happens is people come out of graduate school, they may have the clinical skills, but they know nothing about the fact that they're really a business, and there are expenditures that they should make, and there are return on investments. So buying a subscription or buying a system requires you to put some money out, but you get that money back if you play your cards right and you do it correctly. So all these people know, they get out of graduate school, they have no business understanding at all. They figure, all right, I got a business card, I got a telephone number, and I'm renting space. Here I am.
Right.
Well, it doesn't work that way. So well, they don't understand that piece. And I think that technology is still intimidating to some people. And I think that they're not comfortable with the technology. And the technology that we're at now, I think, is still in its formative years. I still think that there's a certain amount of technology ability you have to use VR or extended reality correctly. And I think you have to think outside the box. So, there are people, for example, who come in and say, I have trouble with heights, or I have trouble with bridges. I might have to find a very different virtual environment that's not that stimulates them and causes that anxiety. And so I have to kind of like play with it until I figure out the right virtual environment for them. Or I might use something like off the internet, like a YouTube, a 360 YouTube, or a Google Earth environment where, let's say, someone had a car accident on a particular corner. I could put them on that corner. But you're thinking outside the box. It's not handed to me, and so
it's not packaged in a way where you can just kind of. It makes a ton of sense. You're still at the edge. You're still kind of you're still making a website on Publisher, if you will.
Right. And I also think that, laughingly, we say that it takes about 20 years for a technology to become embedded in kind of mass clinical practices. And although virtual reality has been around for a long time, I really think my mark is about 2016. That's when things started to turn around. Now, 2016 was supposed to be the year of VR. That didn't happen. But I think that's the start when things started to make it into, like, the awareness of clinicians and the awareness of medical people. And so if it takes 20 years, I think, we're at year 7.
So your guess is 2036-ish.
Well, maybe 2030, somewhere in there.
I think that's a fair and sober assessment of where kind of the field is, and I think that it's more of a reason why we need folks like you who are kind of pushing the edge, and frankly, things like the American Medical Extended Reality Association to start creating kind of those foundational pieces that enable, because let's say it's 2036. Let's call it Price is Right rules, 2041 or whatever. Or when that happens, you want to have like pioneers and folks who have shown the road forward. That it's going to be based on that, and then you need these foundational groups to help legitimize and also distribute and disperse the best practices, the evidence, and hopefully break down some of those barriers. I find it fascinating that you, like, a lot of the barriers that you kind of laid out, other than the kind of cultural cultural barriers, I would say, a lot of the educational ones, I think we can affect now. I'd love to be able to, part of why we built AMXRA is so that we can help with this. One of our core initiatives is education.
Right.
So I'd love to talk offline about how we can think about how do we create that certificate, right? How do we make something valuable and tangible that could help kind of spread this practice so others could do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's been no centralized credentialing body.
Yeah.
And there's been no sets of, I mean, even though there are kind of guidelines and companies themselves are really trying to promote, like even Amelia has constant lessons and constant instructions and support. And they're probably not the only ones, but I think everyone's trying to come up with a system to quantify and qualify what, extended reality is and how to do it correctly. So yeah, I think that your organization is perfect because it's positioned in the right spot at the right time, because this is still like the wild, wild west in many respects.
The wild, wild west.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. So I want to kind of go back to one of the first things you said early on, which is you kind of got into all of this. It sounds like because you're a geek at heart. Tell me more about that. So, it sounds like you've just been kind of in on this for what was the seed for that? Sci-fi or gaming? Personally for me, I can trace my lineage back to just a love of like gadgets that bleep and video games, and that's been like kind of the true north for everything I've kind of moved forward with in my medical and professional career. What about yourself?
Well, I mean, I'm going to date myself now. I grew up in a family of all electricians, and I was actually an apprentice. I was a college apprentice. The deal was I was a local 3 electrical apprentice while I was in school, and the deal was that I was supposed to work during the summers at 4th year pay, and then when I graduated college, I was supposed to go into the union full time at 4th year pay. But I chose to go to graduate school instead. The last job I was on, I think, was the World Trade Center in '72. And I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. It's grueling. Anyway, so but I still loved working with electrical work and electronics. And I unfortunately, as a kid, I took everything apart in my parents' house. And sometimes I got it back together again, and sometimes I didn't. And so I would always try to modify things and create things. And that's, where my geekiness started. And then I always kind of like tried to figure out how to make things work better and more efficiently. And I've had my failures, but it came out of that. And then, I was not a video gamer because there weren't any video games when I was growing up. Pong first came out, when I was like a teenager. And, but that was it. And that was kind of boring. It was just, 2 paddles and a ball going back and forth. But, I used to like do like, CB work, work with, walkie-talkies and all kinds of stuff. So I was always very, as I said, techie, and I always try to figure out how to speed things up in private practice as well. And so I was always looking for things to make it more efficient, tools to make my practice more efficient, both on the the clinical side and also on the administrative side. As I said earlier, so to me, and I'll go back. Star Trek, I think it was the second generation of Star Trek, not the first, had something called the holodeck.
Next gen, right? Holodeck. I'm not a Trekkie, but I know enough. Holodeck.
Right. Yep. The holodeck. And to me, that was where that's my goal. That's where I want extended reality to go to. Because in the holodeck, what happened was, it was obviously the R&R on the ship. They go into this room, and let's say they wanted to like dress up as a an 1800 Western saloon or something. And so they would plug it in, and the room was a blank, and then all of a sudden it was populated by interactive avatars who would respond appropriately to these airmen, the people on the Star Trek on the ship. And I'm thinking, wow, if we could do that in clinical work, I could set up, every environment would be completely individualized. And let's say I had somebody had a social difficulty or an addiction issue. I'm there with them in this environment where the avatars, the entire world is created to meet that particular need. I could work through everything they're dealing with, their thoughts, their feelings. That's, to me, like my wish.
No, it makes a ton of sense. I think so many Valhalla kind of use cases, like the true norths of kind of XR, and frankly, a lot of emerging technology is based. I feel like the blueprints are in things like sci-fi and Star Trek and we're gonna get there. I mean, it's kind of incredible just to see where we, even hearing kind of your experience with VR from 2000 to now, it's kind of incredible to see just the progress in that 20 years before mass adoption, right? So, I mean, I think we're preaching to the choir here in the sense that we're all hopeful and relatively confident. I'm confident that we're going to get to mass adoption. Maybe it'll be 20 years. Hopefully it's sooner. Maybe it's a little later, but we're going to get there. But it's important that we're kind of moving, like what you're doing.
Yeah.
As an informaticist, I'm a clinical informaticist. You also mentioned that you digitized your workflow in the 90s. I got to ask about that. What were you doing? Like, now that must have been fully custom. Or were you on like Windows or DOS, or what were you using
DOS.
back then?
It was DOS.
DOS.
Yeah.
Wow. Like WordPerfect, was that even a DOS program? WordPerfect and like the Quattro and things like. Okay, no. What were you using?
So there was a proprietary program that was created by these two guys that basically could keep track of my sessions and the billing.
Yeah.
And it was all in DOS. And they still exist, and I still use them, but they've kind of morphed into a much larger entity. They were bought up, and so now it's a company called Brand Software, and they have a program called Therapist Helper, which I use.
So you've been using them since the 90s.
Yes.
They're like a power user. They should be. You should like have a. I hope you have like a legacy rate for.
No, I don't. It's okay. I don't care about that. I mean, it's not a big expenditure to subscribe to the practice software, but and now all of a sudden everyone else is doing it. Here's another example. And I think the pandemic has created a lot of opportunities and opened up a lot of doors. So, the idea of doing virtual reality therapy or virtual therapy online was very alien even 4 or 5 years ago. So when I graduated, I think 10 years ago, I got a degree in telemental health. I'm board certified in telemental health. And all my friends again looked at me like, "What's that all about?" I said, "Why would you do that?" And this is before pandemic. I went, "You'll see. You're going to need it." All right. And so all of a sudden the pandemic hit, and now everyone is like doing therapy online. But therapy online before was basically like parapsychology. Nobody did that. That's not legitimate. That's not face-to-face therapy. But now all of a sudden, because of the pandemic, it's now received and accepted. And the same thing happened. Just to give you more geekiness of mine, I did two things that I guess other people didn't do. One was I started collecting data on the number of and different companies in the world of behavioral health and VR. Right?
Yeah.
So I told you when I started, there was really one. I'm up to 116.
Wow.
And so I've been collecting companies all over the world. There are a lot of little startups, and I think the pandemic has sped that up as well, because now people see the benefit of using VR and of using AI even in therapy. And so there's going to be like a washout of companies because they can't all survive.
Yeah.
But the stronger ones are going to be there. And I actually am an ambassador for Amelia Virtual Care, and I see them as one of the stronger players in the behavioral health realm. So I was collecting this data on companies, and I don't know if you're Walter Greenleaf. You know Walter?
Walter Greenleaf, yeah, he actually is a member of AMXRA, as is Skip Rizzo.
Right. So Walter, when I had 50 people on my list of companies, Walter had 200 on his list because he was collecting companies that were just across the board using extended reality and virtual reality. Didn't matter where they were, because obviously there's a lot of territory that I'm not interested in. So I've been doing that, and I've been disseminating my list. Anyone who wants my list, I just send them my list, because it's important, I think, to kind of be on top of that. And the other thing I did was, as a VR therapist, people know who I am. They find me online.
Yeah.
But as you know, our licenses are state mandated and state connected. So I happen to be licensed in New York and Florida. So I get calls all the time from people from other states. And I would have to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I'm not licensed in your state. Let me see if I could find somebody who does virtual reality in your state. And you know what? It was difficult to find people, because clinicians didn't promote it. They didn't advertise that they do that. So I created a directory of virtual reality therapists. So it's vrtherapistinternational.com. And I've been trying to get therapists to list themselves in an effort to, kind of talk to one another and market, and then also become a resource for the general population to find VR therapists wherever they are. So
well, Howard, I would love to, we should again talk about that. We should, how can we use AMXRA to help amplify that resource? I think that would be a wonderful opportunity to kind of just kind of use both kind of resources and amplify, and hopefully, consolidate some of these things. I think that's a great resource, frankly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, but it's been difficult to work with because people don't step up. So I have about maybe 60 people on my directory, and I'm talking worldwide. And I know there are probably thousands of people worldwide using VR, but they just don't market themselves, or they're not comfortable marketing VR or whatever. I don't get it. But again, it's just an outgrowth of my little geekiness.
No, I love it. I mean, I know there are a handful of mental health clinicians. By handful, I mean actually a considerable amount within AMXRA. I think one thing that's just kind of going through my gears right now is we work towards an initiative that would fulfill our education kind of commitment and our community commitment on creating kind of maybe a certificate program for kind of VR training or therapy, and then have essentially a version of kind of your list as a directory for that, like people who are certified, right? And I'd love to work with you if you're interested on furthering that and seeing how that could potentially work. But that's why we built this thing, right? We want to try and advance these initiatives. So really exciting stuff.
Yeah, I still think it's all. That's why your organization and your AMXRA is I think a good foundation, because it's just I'm probably like other people in the field who we're kind of like grasping in straws and trying to put things together. But in isolation, it's very difficult to do that. And my list is based on this little site that I built in WordPress, which is not great for building directories, by the way. It's not designed for that, so it's a lot of work just to maintain that.
Right.
And I always told all these people, I'm not monetizing this. I'm not looking to build, a career out of this. I just
Yeah.
found that there was a need that I had, and if I had it, then other people had it. And to promote VR, we have to become more available, and
Yeah.
also have some kind of exposure that people know we exist.
I love it. It makes a ton of sense. It makes a ton of sense. Um, I think we got a flavor of this throughout our conversation, but specifically for the mental health and psychology side, as a practicing therapist, what is most exciting about the field of XR, kind of looking forward, other than mass adoption in 2036? What do you find to be like kind of most exciting about the field?
I think it makes so much clinical sense to
Yeah,
use it, and I think it's efficient. The idea of, I could say to somebody who calls me, um, how many, how many sessions is it going to take to fix this problem? I could say, well, under 10. And they're floored because everyone knows, oh, therapy, you're in therapy for years. But you don't have to be in therapy for years. If you come in with a problem that we can deal with because it's focused and you need to get to a certain point, we could fix that really fast. You couldn't do that before in traditional therapy. So it's, to me, extended reality, virtual reality, those are tools. It's not,
yeah,
and that's not a new therapeutic approach. It's kind of like exposure therapy on steroids. It
right.
works faster, it's efficient. And to me, that's important. And so to me, the beauty of this is that it works,
Yeah,
and people find it entertaining, and the follow through is there, and the dropout rate isn't as bad with VR versus traditional therapy, and it's beneficial. And we could work with, I've worked with people from 7 to 88,
wow, wow. So
and
across the spectrum.
yeah, across the spectrum. Yeah.
It's interesting. Maybe the analog is, it's like back in the day, George Washington had, famously, maybe not, but the saying is he had wooden teeth,
Right.
and it probably worked at the time, but now you can just get an implant,
Hmm.
and maybe in 10 years, I think I read recently, there's apparently some new drug that might just like regrow um, your adult tooth.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, and it's like it's one of those things where, to your point about XR, VR being just a tool, why would you not want to use the thing that will just regrow the tooth?
Hmm.
That's it makes a ton of sense to me, but as you know, I'm biased.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
as I think about this, we started this conversation with kind of the three questions I would ask, and I think we've hit them.
Hmm.
But I actually want to add a couple more, if you have time. Do you have a little bit more time?
I have a
Because
little
I
bit more
think
time. Yeah.
a
Yeah.
little bit more. Okay, okay. I want to, as we were thinking about this, particularly since your field of mental health is one where what's so fascinating to me about kind of XR and this field is as I started learning about it, and I just started this like two plus years ago, so I'm still learning every day. But what struck me was that the applications for XR kind of spread the gamut of medicine and clinical therapies, both from like fields like mental health to like kind of the really like procedural fields like surgery and
Hmm.
kind of interventional radiology, and they all had kind of unique use cases that utilized XR as a tool. And I've been thinking about like this concept of like what are the Valhalla use cases for each of like these specialties. And it sounds like one of them for you, Howard, for mental health is the holodeck use case, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Recreating reality with like full control of the situation,
Right.
and seeing what you can do. Are there other Valhalla use cases in your mind for mental health?
Um, I'm very focused on what I do, which is,
Yeah,
phobias and anxieties. And clearly, VR can be used for a variety of things.
yeah,
Um, but I think it's important to stay within your specialty range. So,
Okay.
there are people who have substance abuse training, and they could clearly use it for that, or eating disorders, which is a whole different ballgame,
Yeah.
and autistic children, and pain management. I mean, it's huge. The gamut is huge. But I think that the holodeck can be used for a lot of things. But I also think that for your standard stuff like pain management,
Yeah.
I think it could be, again, the idea of getting somebody out of their head, getting somebody to focus on X, not Y. It's like a magic trick. Look at this hand, don't look at that hand.
Yeah.
If I can get people to focus on something that's not pain or not uncomfortable, and get their brain there, then that's, to me, the ultimate goal. So
Makes sense.
I always say to people, my patients, your brain, I don't care what your wife says, your brain can only do one thing at a time. Okay. I know you see. So if I could get you to focus on X, you're not focusing on Y. And I tell them that I call it my stupid scar. I was working with a drill once, and you're supposed to let the drill bit do the work, and you're not supposed to press. But I'm in a hurry, and the drill slipped. I drilled right through my hand.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Right, but you think that. So I'm now in my living room, and I pull the drill out of my hand, and I said to my wife, "Wow, that was interesting." She said, "Yeah, we're going to the hospital." I said, "No, that's not the point. The point is, I never took my finger off the trigger. I was focused on something else. I was rushed. Because I was rushed, I never kind of felt it go through. I felt the chuck of the drill hit me, but I never felt the bit kind of go through me."
Wow.
Because I wasn't focused. I was so distracted. And to me, that's the beauty of VR and extended reality, getting people in a place where their brain is doing one thing and they're not focusing on something
Full
else.
focus.
Yeah.
Makes a ton of sense. All right. I'm aware of the time. We're going to speed around the last question I have. You kind of answered it, but I want to, Valhalla use cases and then grand challenges. So what are the grand challenges for mental health that you see with XR? What are the things like and you've kind of laid out a couple: education, adoption, culture. If you were to kind of list like the most near-term grand challenge that needs to be addressed, what would you say it is?
I think the biggest thing for me is awareness.
Awareness.
Yeah. And I think that because there's a lack of awareness of the benefits of VR and extended reality in clinical practice, I think once we got to get past that, people have to know it exists before they even start to question whether they should adopt it in their practices or not. It's almost like, something out there, way out there, beyond the realm of their thinking. And so I think mass acceptance of extended reality, it used to be that, I think that technological people came first, and then it filtered down to the public.
Yeah.
And I think in this case, I think it has to start with the public and then go up. Because I think if everyone understood what virtual reality was, and there was like a virtual reality headset in everyone's home, I think people would become more attuned to it and accept it, and then they could recognize how it could be useful. But I think awareness, to me, is the first border that we have to cross, and it's because people don't know it exists.
I think you're absolutely on the money. I mean, for me, living through the rise of kind of the smartphone, there was certainly a push from the top, from leaders and early adopters in medicine. But I think when it became truly ubiquitous, when it became culturally ubiquitous, and then everyone just expected, all clinicians expected, kind of these services and tools to live on our devices, and frankly, the industry is just catching up. My my other job, my real job, is focused around kind of digital implementation. And most of the stuff we're doing is, mobile application, things that you would expect exist but haven't yet because we're catching up.
Right.
I suspect that's probably going to be the case with most emerging technologies that truly have widespread impact, which I think XR will be, where you're going to see the mass adoption on both fronts. But I think at the bottom up is going to drive, right? Like the cultural adoption is what's really going to make it just become a norm. And then all of a sudden, everyone just expects kind of these things to exist.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately, there's still no major compelling reason why people would pick up VR or extended reality yet. And I think that, if the technology companies put their money where it needs to be and make it much more, as you say, ubiquitous and useful and meaningful in daily life, then it'll become more accepted. The idea of, like if I leave the house without my cell phone, I get yelled at.
Yeah, you would feel it, right? Like it's like wallet, key, cell phone. Oh, chances are you forget your wallet before your cell phone most of the time, at least for me.
Right. Yeah. So to me, it's where we came from.
Yeah.
To now, is amazing. I actually was one of the first adopters of cell phones too. I had a Nokia. I think it was a Nokia, it was an Oki 900. It was like a
Oki
brick.
900.
Yeah, it was a brick. If I put it in my jacket pocket, my jacket would pull me down. And at that time, it was $1 a minute.
Wow.
Or any portion of a dollar. So if you were on the phone for a minute and 1 second, it was $2.
Wow.
So I only used it for emergency purposes, but it must have been in the 80s. I don't know when I had that thing. So yeah, but what I'm saying is that cell phones and watches and technology now become part of our lives, and we can't figure out how we would live without it. And that's where VR has to be, and extended reality has to be.
That's the threshold. That's hopefully the next threshold is it becomes ubiquitous.
Right.
But Howard, this has been a real pleasure. I feel like we really crossed and touched a lot of ground. Where can people outside of in the walls of the American Medical Extended Reality Association, how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way?
They can just email me. It's hgurr@drsgurr.com.
And it's been a real pleasure.
Yes.
Anything you want to say on closing it out?
I'm glad that you created this organization, and I'm very hopeful that it's going to be one of the premier organizations in this field. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and me too. All right, thanks so much.
Okay, Mark, take it easy.
All right.
Bye-bye.
This has been a production of the American Medical Extended Reality Association. Our mission is to advance the science and practice of medical extended reality through advancing care delivery, scientific investigation, innovation, education, advocacy, and community. If you are interested in learning more or joining AMXRA, please go to www.amxra.org to learn more. Bye now.